Mercedes did not just fight extreme heat. Mercedes may have turned it into horsepower. Because while every other team was trying to cool the new power units down, the W17 may have been doing something far more dangerous. Using heat as the trigger. Cold in the garage, legal. Hot on the straight, stronger. Then cold again, clean. And that is why the paddock exploded. Because the FIA limit was supposed to stop every engine at 16:1 compression. But Mercedes allegedly found the gap nobody saw coming. The rule measured the engine cold. The race happened hot. And when the W17 reached full racing temperature, the same heat that usually destroys performance may have pushed the engine toward a hidden power state rivals could not detect in static checks. That is not just clever. That is terrifying. Because if the system was illegal, Mercedes had a scandal. But if it was legal under the wording of the rules, then the rest of Formula One had an even bigger problem. Mercedes had found a way to make the car more powerful when it mattered most, and invisible when it was inspected. Subscribe to the channel. At first, the W17 did not look like a scandal. It looked like Mercedes had simply done what Mercedes has done so many times before. Read the regulations earlier. Prepared better. Built smarter. Arrived calmer. And when the new era began, the car looked ready in a way that made the rest of the grid uncomfortable. That is the easy explanation. Mercedes understood the rules. Brixworth delivered the power unit. Brackley built the chassis around it. Russell and Antonelli had a car capable of controlling the race. And everyone else was just behind. But the deeper fear was not that Mercedes was fast. The deeper fear was how the car seemed to become fast. Because in Formula One, speed is never only speed. Speed has a source. A reason. A chain of causes hidden beneath the bodywork. And with the W17, rivals began to wonder whether that source was not only aerodynamic, not only hybrid, not only setup, but thermal. Heat. The one thing every Formula One engineer normally fears. Heat damages tires. Heat threatens reliability. Heat forces cooling compromises. Heat makes teams open bodywork, add drag, protect systems, and sacrifice lap time just to keep the car alive. But Mercedes may have looked at the same enemy and asked a different question. What if heat could be useful? That is where the story becomes dangerous. Because the new engine regulations were supposed to create a hard limit. 16:1 compression. A ceiling that every manufacturer had to respect. A line designed to stop one power unit from building an old-style combustion advantage while the sport moved into a new hybrid era. On paper, it looked clean. Simple. Fair. But Formula One is not one on paper. It is one in the gap between what the rule intends and what the rule actually says. And according to the source material, the alleged Mercedes exploit lived inside that gap. The engine could measure legally when cold. The components could sit at the 16:1 limit in the garage, on the dyno, or under static inspection. Everything would appear compliant. Nothing obvious. Nothing dramatic. Nothing the FIA could reject under the original cold condition wording. But then the engine would heat up. The car would leave the garage. The temperature would rise. The materials inside the combustion chamber would expand. And when the W17 reached full operating temperature on track, the effective compression ratio allegedly increased toward a higher state. That is the moment rivals feared. Because the car inspected cold may not have been the same car racing hot. And that idea cuts straight into the heart of Formula One legality. A static check tells you what the car is at rest. A race tells you what the car becomes under pressure. And if Mercedes had built a power unit that changed its performance state only when heat arrived, then the W17 was not just powerful. It was conditional. Legal when measured cold. Stronger when racing hot. Then cooling back toward safety when it returned to the pits. That is why the alleged system was so hard to ignore. It did not need to announce itself. It did not need a visible device. It did not need a driver pressing a secret button. It lived in material behavior. Expansion. Temperature. Combustion. The invisible language of engineering. And that is why rivals would have been furious. Because you cannot easily photograph a thermal loophole. You cannot point to it from an onboard camera. You cannot see it in the way fans see a new wing or a strange floor edge. You feel it in the straight line speed. You infer it from the acceleration. You compare it through telemetry. You hear it in the complaints from other teams. And then you ask the only question that matters. How is Mercedes getting that power while still passing the checks? That question is what turned the W17 from a fast car into a paddock mystery. Because if the answer was simple, rivals could accept it. A better combustion design. A more efficient hybrid strategy. Cleaner energy deployment. Better packaging. A superior cooling layout. Those are painful, but they are normal. But if the answer was that Mercedes had found a way to exploit when the compression ratio was measured, then the controversy becomes much bigger. Because then the fight is not only about horsepower. It is about the rulebook itself. The difference between cold legality and hot performance. The difference between what the FIA could prove in the garage and what rivals believed was happening on the straight. That difference is where suspicion grows. And suspicion, in Formula One, is powerful even before guilt is proven. A rival does not need the full blueprint to start applying pressure. They only need the performance to look wrong. Too strong on the straights. Too comfortable with aero load. Too able to defend. Too able to carry downforce without losing the punch other teams expected them to lose. That is why the W17 became so threatening. Because extra combustion power does not only make a car faster in a straight line. It changes everything around it. If Mercedes has more engine power, they can run more wing and still defend on the straight. More wing gives more corner stability. More stability protects the tires. Better tire life gives strategy freedom. Strategy freedom gives the driver control. And suddenly, what started as a power unit trick begins to look like a complete car advantage. That is the terrifying part. A hidden thermal system would not only appear as horsepower. It would appear as calm. A car that looks planted. A car that does not need to trim itself too aggressively. A car that can be strong in corners and still survive the straights. A car that lets Russell attack without feeling exposed. That is why rival teams would not just watch the speed traps. They would watch the whole race. How did the Mercedes defend? How did it manage tires? How did it behave late in the stint? How did it compare when the engine was fully hot? How did the pace look after repeated push laps? Because if the alleged advantage only arrived at operating temperature, then the strongest Mercedes would appear exactly when the race was most intense. Not sitting still. Not in the garage. Not in the inspection bay. On the track. Under load. At full heat. That is what makes the concept so cinematic. The hotter the fight became, the stronger the car may have become. Every lap added temperature. Every push phase brought the engine closer to its performance state. Every straight became a place where the alleged compression advantage could reveal itself. And every time the Mercedes pulled away, rivals had to wonder whether they were racing the same engine the FIA had measured. That is the nightmare for a governing body. Because a regulation is only as strong as its testing method. If the rule limits compression but only checks it cold, then the test may miss the moment that matters. And in racing, the moment that matters is not cold. It is hot. That is why the FIA's later move toward hot condition monitoring became so important. It was not just a technical adjustment. It was an admission that temperature could not be ignored. The car had to be judged closer to the state in which it actually competed. And once that changed, the entire narrative around Mercedes shifted. Before that, the W17 could be framed as a brilliant interpretation. After that, people began asking why the interpretation needed closing. That is the power of timing. When a loophole is closed, everyone looks back at the advantage that came before it. They ask how much it was worth. How many races it influenced. How many points were scored before the door shut. How much confidence Mercedes built while rivals were still trying to decode the mechanism. And that is why the early part of the season mattered so much. A loophole does not need to last all year. It only needs to last long enough to shape the championship. Long enough to win races. Long enough to build a points lead. Long enough to make rivals change direction. Long enough to give drivers belief. That is the ruthless truth of Formula One. A 3-month advantage can decide a season if it arrives at the start. Because the rest of the grid is not only chasing lap time. They are chasing understanding. And understanding takes longer than suspicion. You can suspect Mercedes in one weekend. But proving the mechanism, writing the clarification, changing the test, and neutralizing the advantage can take months. Mercedes, meanwhile, keeps racing, keeps scoring, keeps learning, keeps turning the controversial window into real championship damage. That is why rivals were so alarmed. Ferrari, Red Bull powertrains with Ford, Audi, and others were not just angry about one car being fast. They were facing the possibility that the new era had been shaped before it truly began. The compression limit was meant to attract manufacturers. It was meant to create confidence. It was meant to say, nobody will arrive with a massive combustion advantage. But if the limit only worked cold, and if Mercedes found a way to increase effective compression hot, then the promise of equality was weakened. Not broken in the obvious sense. Weakened by wording. And wording is everything in Formula One. One phrase can create a championship. One missing condition can create a loophole. One measurement temperature can decide who starts the season ahead. That is why the W17 story feels bigger than Mercedes. It is a warning about modern Formula One itself. The cars are no longer only mechanical machines. They are legal arguments at 300 kilometers per hour. Every component is designed not just for performance, but for compliance in a specific testing condition. At rest, under load, at temperature, during deployment, during braking, during recovery. The question is no longer just, can the car go faster? The question is, can the car go faster in a way the test does not fully capture? That is the battlefield Mercedes may have found. And that is why the first block of this story cannot end with a simple accusation. Because the most powerful version of this controversy is not that Mercedes blindly cheated. It is that Mercedes may have found the most Formula One kind of advantage possible. A car that obeyed the rule as written, but challenged the spirit of why the rule existed. That is much harder to attack. Because if a team breaks the rule, punishment is simple. But if a team exposes a weakness in the rule, the entire sport has to respond. The FIA has to change the testing method. Rivals have to argue fairness. Mercedes gets to say, we complied. And the championship keeps the points already scored. That is why the alleged thermal system is so frightening. It turns the rulebook into a stopwatch advantage. It turns heat into a trigger. It turns inspection conditions into part of the design. It turns the engine into two different stories. The cold story the FIA can measure. And the hot story rivals fear on track. That split is the heart of the mystery. And it is the reason the W17 became one of the most controversial cars of the season. Because if extreme heat really gave Mercedes a hidden performance state, then the car was not just managing temperature. It was using temperature as a weapon. The engine did not merely survive the heat. It may have needed it. And that idea changes the way you see every Mercedes lap. Every time the car left the pits, it was not just starting a run.